Delphine Merritt counted the coins out loud, one by one. Right there in the middle of Crooked Pine's main square, with half the town watching and not one soul saying a word. $32, she announced, dropping the last coin into her palm with a sound that cut through the morning air like a slap. That's what I owe you, Calder. And that... She grabbed Josephine's arm and shoved her forward so hard the girl nearly fell into the dirt. That is how I'm paying it back. Josephine was 19 years old. She had done nothing wrong. She had nowhere to run, and every single person standing in that square looked away. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're in exactly the right place. Hit that subscribe button and follow every chapter with me, because the stories we tell here will shock you, move you, and remind you what it means to be human. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get back to Josephine, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about monsters. The morning it happened, Josephine had been hanging laundry. That was the thing she'd think about later. Not the humiliation, not the crowd, not even the way Delphine's fingers dug into her arm like fish hooks. She'd think about the laundry. 3 of her father's old shirts, still damp, left hanging on the line behind the house. Nobody would bring them in. They'd just hang there until they stiffened in the cold, and she realized, somewhere in the back of her mind, that she would probably never fold them again. Delphine hadn't told her where they were going. "Get your coat," she'd said. Just that. No explanation, no warmth in her voice, not that there ever was. Just those 3 words delivered the way someone orders a dog to sit. And Josephine had learned, over 5 years of living under Delphine Merritt's roof, that questions were more trouble than they were worth. So she'd gotten her coat. A brown wool thing, too thin for October, with a button missing at the collar. She'd meant to fix it. She was always meaning to fix things. They walked into town in silence. Josephine noticed that Delphine had worn her good dress. The dark green one she only brought out for church, or for situations she considered important. That was the first sign that something was different about today. The second sign was the way Delphine kept looking at her sideways, like she was calculating something, like she was doing arithmetic in her head, and Josephine was one of the numbers. Crooked Pine was not a large town. 1 main road, 2 dozen buildings, a general store, a saloon, and a livery stable that smelled like it hadn't been cleaned since before the war. Most mornings it was quiet. People went about their business with their heads down. That was how things worked in a town built on debt and hard winters. You kept your eyes forward and your mouth shut, and you minded what was yours. But that morning, there were people standing in the square. Not gathered, exactly. Not the way people gather for a hanging or a cattle auction. It was more like they drifted there. Shopkeepers lingering in doorways, a couple of men by the post office pretending to talk about nothing. Old Mrs. Hargrove sitting on a bench with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes pointing somewhere else entirely. They were all there. And they all knew something Josephine didn't. She found out when Delphine stopped walking, right there in the middle of the square, right there where everyone could see. "Stay here," Delphine said. And then she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the coins. Josephine watched her count them and felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear, not yet, just a wrongness. The particular feeling of standing in a place where the rules have changed and nobody told you. $32, Delphine announced. "That's what I owe you, Calder." Josephine turned. He was standing maybe 15 feet away, and she hadn't even noticed him. That was the first strange thing about Silas Calder, so not his size, not the scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to the edge of his jaw, not the way he held himself slightly off balance because of the leg that didn't work quite right. The strange thing was how still he was. Most men of his reputation moved like they wanted you to know they were dangerous. Silas Calder just stood there, like a rock that had always been in that particular spot, and would be there long after everyone else was gone. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 40, maybe a little past it. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that looked like it had weathered more than one bad season. His coat was heavy canvas, well worn but clean, and he held his hat in both hands in front of him like he was at a funeral. He didn't say anything when Delphine counted the coins. He just watched. Then Delphine grabbed Josephine's arm. The shove wasn't hard enough to knock her down, but it was hard enough to make her stumble, hard enough to make the watching crowd shift uncomfortably, not uncomfortably enough to speak, not uncomfortably enough to move, just enough to let you know they knew it was wrong and had already decided not to care. "And that is how I'm paying it back," Delphine said. For a moment, Josephine genuinely did not understand. Her mind refused to put the pieces together. Because surely, what she was hearing couldn't mean what it sounded like. Surely her stepmother wasn't standing in the middle of a public square announcing that Josephine was the currency. Surely not. "I don't," Josephine started. "Quiet," Delphine snapped. She didn't even look at her. She was still looking at Calder, the way you look at a business partner after you've signed the last page. She's healthy, works hard, she can read and write, which is more than most. A pause. "You won't find better value for $32 in this territory, and you know it." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Josephine had ever heard. She looked at the people standing around them. Mrs. Hargrove still staring at her hands, the men by the post office now examining the ground, the shopkeeper in his doorway, suddenly very interested in the wood grain of his doorframe. Not one face turned toward her. Not one voice rose. She was 19 years old, and she had just been offered as payment for a debt, and the entire town of Crooked Pine was going to let it happen. Something happened inside her chest then. Not quite rage, not quite grief. Something in between, something without a clean name. Her hands balled into fists inside her coat pockets. Her jaw tightened until she could feel her back teeth grinding together. She was not going to cry. She had made that decision years ago, and she had not broken it yet, and she was not going to break it now. Not here, not in front of these people who had already decided she wasn't worth the trouble of a single word. She looked at Silas Calder. He was looking at her, not at Delphine, at her. And his expression was, she couldn't read it exactly. It wasn't hunger, which was what she'd feared. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something more complicated than either of those things, and it made her feel, for one disorienting second, like he was the one who'd just been told something unexpected. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Delphine. "How long has she owed you?" he asked. His voice was lower than she expected, and slower, like a man who chose words with some care because he'd learned they cost something. Delphine blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The debt. How long has this girl been carrying it?" "She hasn't been carrying anything. I'm the one who—" "Whose debt is it?" Silas said. Not loud, not aggressive, just patient in a way that was somehow more pressuring than anger. "Hers or yours?" Delphine's jaw tightened. "The finances of my household are not your—" "You said she's paying it." He still wasn't raising his voice. "So I'm asking whose debt it is." The silence stretched. Josephine realized she was holding her breath. "It doesn't matter whose debt it is," Delphine said finally, clipping the word short. "The arrangement is simple. You're owed $32 and I'm offering you something worth considerably more. No." One word. Just that. Delphine stared at him. "I beg your—" "No," he said again. He stepped forward and held out the coins. All of them, every last one, back toward Delphine. His face was unreadable. His voice was completely level. "I don't buy people, Mrs. Merritt. I don't take people as payment. And I'm not going to start today." The sound that went through the watching crowd was barely a sound at all, more like a collective exhale. Something shifting. Delphine's face went red. Not the flush of embarrassment, the flush of someone who had planned carefully and is watching the plan unravel in public. Calder, "We had an arrangement. We had a conversation," he said. "You told me you had a way to settle the debt. I didn't agree to terms I hadn't heard." He was still holding the coins out, patient as stone. "Take them back." "I will not." "Take them back," he said one more time, quiet and final. Delphine grabbed the coins. Her hand was shaking, but not from sadness, from fury. The kind of fury that belongs to people who believe they've been cheated out of something that was rightfully theirs, even when the thing they wanted was a person. She turned to Josephine then, and the look on her face was the worst part. Not rage, something colder than rage. calculation, like she was already revising her plans, already trying to find another angle. Then she can stay in the street, Delphine said. I'm done with her. And she walked away. Just like that, turned on her heel and walked back up the street without looking back, the green dress swishing around her ankles, the coins back in her pocket, and Josephine standing alone in the middle of the square with nothing but the coat with the missing button and a life that had just been erased. Josephine stood very still. She was aware, distantly, that people were still watching. She was aware that her face was doing something she couldn't control, some small tremor at the corner of her mouth that was the closest she would allow herself to falling apart. She kept her eyes straight ahead. She kept her hands in her pockets. She would not ask for help. She had never in her life been offered help for free, and she was not going to stand in the street and beg for it from people who just watched her get handed over like livestock without saying a single word. Heavy footsteps on the packed dirt, not hurried, just steady. Silas Calder stopped a few feet away from her, close enough to speak without broadcasting the conversation to the whole street, far enough that she didn't feel crowded. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked. She looked at him. "No." He nodded, like that was information he'd already suspected. "You got any family in the area? Anyone she doesn't control?" "No." Another nod. He looked down at his hat, turned it once in his hands. "I've got a ranch up on the north side of the mountain, about 4 hours' ride." He paused. "I need someone who can manage correspondence, keep records. My handwriting is bad enough that I've lost 2 contracts in the last year because nobody could read the numbers right." He looked up at her. "Your stepmother said you can read and write." "She wasn't lying about that," Josephine said. "I pay fair wages," he said. "Same as I'd pay any ranch hand, no more, no less. You'd have your own room with a lock on the door. The key is yours. I don't keep copies." He held her gaze steady when he said that part, like he knew why it mattered. "You work for me, not for me. You understand the difference?" She studied his face, the scar, the gray at his temples, the deep set of his eyes. She was looking for the thing hiding behind the reasonable offer, because there was always something hiding. There had always been something hiding. She didn't find it, which either meant he was telling the truth or he was very good at hiding things. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I need a records keeper," he said, "and because what just happened in this square was wrong, and I was part of it by agreeing to meet her here without asking enough questions first." He glanced down the street where Delphine had gone. "I don't fix things by half measures." Josephine looked around the square. The crowd was dispersing now, the brief drama over, everyone going back to their ordinary business. Not one person had spoken. Not one. She looked back at Silas Calder. She had 2 choices. She could stay in this street and see how long it took the town of Crooked Pine to offer her something worse. Or she could take the hand of the man everyone in the valley called a monster and find out if the rumors were right. 4 hours' ride, she said. About that. And you're not going to try to renegotiate once we're away from the crowd. Something flickered in his face. Not offense exactly, more like recognition. "No," he said, "I'm not." She took a breath. The cold air stung the inside of her nose. Behind her, somewhere down the street, she could hear Delphine's retreating footsteps, already fading. "All right," Josephine said, "I'll come." They didn't shake hands. They didn't say anything else significant. He just nodded and led her to where his horse was tied at the far end of the square, and she walked beside him, and nobody watched them go except old Mrs. Hargrove, who finally looked up from her hands at the last moment and watched the scarred man and the girl with the missing button walk out of town together. Nobody could have read the old woman's expression. It might have been relief. It might have been guilt. It might have been something in between. The horse was a bay mare, steady-looking and well-kept. Not a show animal, a working animal that knew its job. Silas handed Josephine up onto the saddle without asking permission, then swung himself up behind her with slightly more difficulty than a man his age should have had, and she understood without being told that the leg caused him more trouble than he let on. He didn't mention it. She didn't ask. They rode out of Crooked Pine on the north road into the cold October morning, and behind them the town went back to its usual silence. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The horse moved at an easy pace. The road climbed gradually toward the tree line, leaving the flat valley behind, and the air grew sharper and cleaner with every 100 yards. Josephine sat straight in the saddle and kept her eyes forward. She was running through the inventory of her situation the way she'd learned to do whenever everything changed at once. She had the coat, the dress she was wearing, and about 60 cents she'd kept in her boot for the last 3 months against an emergency. She had no friends in Crooked Pine. She had no family within 2 territories. She had her name and the ability to read and write and add columns of numbers without making mistakes. That was it. That was the total of her resources. "You're thinking very loud," Silas said behind her. She startled slightly. "I wasn't aware I was making noise." "You weren't," he said, "but your back went straight as a fence post about 5 minutes ago. People only sit like that when they're counting something." She said nothing for a moment. Then, because she had decided somewhere in the last hour that strategic honesty was probably her best tool, "I was figuring out what I have." "And?" "Not much." He was quiet. The horse climbed. The pines on either side of the road were getting taller, closer together, the branches blocking out the worst of the wind. "The coat's not heavy enough," he said finally. "I know." "There's a spare in the saddlebag, left side. It's old, but it's wool. You can use it until we get to the ranch and figure out something better." She reached down into the saddlebag and found it, a heavy brown wool coat, much warmer than hers, worn soft with years of use but still solid. She pulled it on over her own. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something she couldn't name, something that made her think of a fire that had been burning a long time. It was too big by a good margin. She didn't care. "Thank you," she said. He didn't say "you're welcome." He just said, "You'll need it. Weather turns fast up here." They rode on. The road narrowed as they climbed until it was barely a track through the trees, and she realized she'd been holding the pommel of the saddle with both hands. Not because she was afraid of falling, because she needed something solid to hold on to. She made herself let go. She had gotten herself out of the square. She was still vertical, still breathing, still thinking. Whatever came next, she would handle it the same way she'd handled everything else in her life. One thing at a time, no wasted motion, no expectation of rescue. But somewhere under all of that, under the practical inventory and the stiff spine and the eyes that wouldn't cry, something else was shifting. Something she didn't have a name for yet. A feeling like the moment just after you let go of a branch over water and you're in the air but you haven't hit the surface yet, and for just that half second, it's neither falling nor flying, just weightless, just open. The mountain loomed ahead of them, massive and quiet, and the horse kept climbing, and Josephine Merritt, who had been traded for a debt she never owed, by a woman who'd never loved her, in front of a town that never saw her, kept riding forward into whatever came next. She didn't know that the man behind her had been watching this mountain for 20 years, that beneath its roots there was silver worth a fortune, that a banker in Crooked Pine had already been watching them both, and that the simple offer of honest work was about to pull them both into the most dangerous situation either of them had ever faced. She only knew that she was no longer standing in the dust. That, for now, was enough. The ranch didn't look like what she'd been afraid of. That was the first thing Josephine registered when they came through the tree line and the property opened up in front of them. Not relief exactly, more like the particular disorientation of bracing for a punch that doesn't land. She'd spent the last hour of the ride building pictures in her head. A dark place. Something heavy and closed in. The kind of home that reflects the man the town believes lives in it. What she found instead was a low timber house with a covered porch running the full length of the front. A barn that was older than the house but soundly built. A woodpile stacked with more precision than she'd have expected from a man living alone. And a yard that was muddy and uneven and cluttered with the normal wreckage of ranch work. A broken wheel leaning against the fence. A bucket with a cracked handle sitting by the water trough. A saddle blanket thrown over the porch rail that had clearly been there long enough to stiffen. It was not a monster's lair. It was just a working man's place that needed another set of hands. Silas swung down from the horse with the careful movement she'd already started to recognize. The way he always led with the good leg. The way he absorbed the landing through his shoulders to spare the other one. He didn't look at her while he did it. She didn't look away. "House is unlocked," he said, handing her the reins. "Go on in if you want to get warm. I'll put the mare up." She took the reins without thinking, then stopped. "I can help." He looked at her. Something shifted briefly in his expression. Not surprise, just a small recalibration. "All right," he said. They put the horse up together. He showed her where the feed was stored, where the tack went, where the water buckets were kept. He didn't explain things more than once. He didn't treat her like she didn't know which end of a horse was which. That alone told her something. Inside, the house was one large main room with a kitchen along the back wall, a heavy table in the middle, two chairs that didn't match each other, and a fireplace that hadn't been lit that morning but had ash in it from the night before. Everything was clean in the way of a man who keeps things functional rather than comfortable. Nothing decorative, nothing soft, but nothing dirty either. Off the main room, a short hallway. 2 doors. "That's mine," Silas said, nodding at the first door without stopping. "This one's yours." He pushed open the second door and stood aside. The room was small, a bed frame with a real mattress, which was more than she'd had at Delphine's in the last 2 years. A window facing east, a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, empty, a hook on the wall for a coat. That was all. And the lock. A solid iron lock, new enough that it still had the brightness of recent hardware on it. The key was in it. He reached past her, careful not to crowd her, and removed the key from the lock. He handed it to her. "Other copy?" she said. "There isn't one," he said. "I meant what I said in town." She closed her hand around the key. It was cold from the air. She could feel the cut edges of the teeth against her palm. "I'll start a fire," he said, already turning back toward the main room. "You hungry?" She was. She was very hungry. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening because Delphine's household ran on a schedule, and the schedule had not included Josephine that morning, for obvious reasons. But she said, "I can cook if you tell me where things are." He paused. "You don't have to do that tonight." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm offering because I want something to do with my hands." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Potatoes in the bin by the back door. Salt pork hanging in the cold pantry. There's a skillet on the second hook." She cooked. He started the fire. They moved around each other in the kitchen with the careful choreography of 2 people learning how much space the other one takes up. And nobody tripped over anyone, and nobody said anything that wasn't necessary. And the silence between them was the kind of silence Josephine hadn't experienced in years. Not hostile, not loaded, just quiet. They ate at the table. The food was plain and it was good, and she ate more than she meant to. Afterward, he pushed back from the table and said, "You'll want to sleep. We can talk about the work in the morning." "What time do you start?" "First light." "I'll be up," she said. He nodded and took his plate to the basin. She watched the way he moved through his own kitchen. Efficient, automatic, no wasted motion. A man who had been living alone long enough that he'd stripped everything down to function. No extras, no performance. She took her plate to the basin and washed both of them without being asked. He didn't say thank you. He just said, "Good night, Miss Merritt." "Josephine," she said, "if we're going to live in the same house." He was quiet for a moment. "Good night, Josephine." She went to her room and locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time with the key in her hand, waiting for the fear to arrive. The fear she'd been holding at arm's length all day. The fear that any minute the real situation would reveal itself, that the reasonable man with the steady voice would turn into something else now that there was no audience. She sat and waited and listened. She heard him banking the fire. She heard his uneven footsteps down the hallway, the first door open and close, a long silence after. Then nothing. Just the wind in the pines outside her window and the settling sounds of an old house getting colder. The fear didn't come. She didn't trust the absence of it. She'd learned not to trust that. But she lay down anyway, still dressed, and pulled the blanket over herself, and she was asleep before she could decide whether that was a good idea. She woke before first light, which was not unusual. She'd been waking before first light since she was 14, and Delphine had made it clear that sleeping in was a luxury for people who deserved it. The fire in the main room had been restoked. There was a pot of coffee on the hook over it. Silas was at the table with a stack of papers in front of him, wearing the same coat from yesterday, frowning at something in his hand like it had personally offended him. "That the correspondence you mentioned?" she asked. He looked up. He hadn't heard her come in, she realized, or if he had, he'd decided not to make a thing of it. "Part of it," he said. "This one's from the land office in Millhaven. They've been sending me the same letter with different numbers for 4 months, and I can't figure out what they actually want." She poured herself coffee. There was only one mug, and she saw him notice her noticing that. And she also saw him make a mental note she couldn't quite read, and came to the table and held out her hand. He gave her the letter. She read it standing up, twice. "They want a survey confirmation," she said. "Your northern boundary. Someone's filed a competing claim on 20 acres of your upper pasture, and they need your original deed language to resolve it." Silence. "Someone filed a competing claim," he repeated. Slowly. The words had a weight to them she didn't fully understand yet. "That's what this said." She set the letter down. "Do you have the original deed?" He was quiet for a moment too long. She looked up from the letter and found him staring at the table with an expression that had gone somewhere complicated, somewhere behind the usual steadiness. "Silas," she said. His first name came out before she'd decided to use it. He didn't correct her. "Do you have the deed?" "I have it," he said. "The question is whether it matches what they recorded." He pushed back from the table and stood, and she could see the decision being made somewhere behind his eyes. How much to say, how much to hold back. He was a man who'd spent a long time being careful about what he let people know. "There's been some irregularities with the land office in Millhaven, properties getting reassessed, boundary lines shifting on paper." He looked at her directly. "Started about 2 years ago, right around the time Harlan Doss bought the bank." She filed the name away. Harlan Doss. "The banker in Crooked Pine?" "Same one." He moved to the fireplace, picked up the poker, moved a log that didn't need moving. Just something to do with his hands. She recognized the impulse. "He's been calling in debts. Old debts. Some of them 20 years old. Families that have been on their land for a generation getting papers saying they owe money they've never heard of." He set the poker back. 3 properties in the valley changed hands in the last 18 months. Doss owns them all now. Josephine looked at the letter in her hand. She looked at the stack of papers on the table. She looked at Silas Calder's back, still facing the fire, carrying something he hadn't planned on sharing with a stranger. "What's on your northern boundary?" she said. He turned around. His face had gone very still. "Why?" "Because someone filed a competing claim on it specifically," she said. "Not a random survey dispute. A competing claim. That means someone looked at your land and decided that particular 20 acres was worth the legal risk." She set the letter down flat on the table. "What's up there?" The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I don't know for certain," he said finally. "But about 3 years ago, a man came through offering to buy this property. Offered twice what it's worth for grazing land." He paused. "I said no. He came back 6 months later with a higher number. I said no again." Another pause. 6 months after that, the land office started sending these letters. "And you think Doss sent that man?" "I think Doss sent that man," he said. Josephine sat down at the table. She pulled the whole stack of papers toward her and started sorting through them. Not because he'd asked her to, but because something was forming in her mind, something with shape and weight, and she needed to understand the full picture before she could figure out what it meant. He watched her for a moment without speaking. "You don't have to do this today," he said. "You just got here." "I'm aware," she said without looking up. "Hand me that deed when you find it." He was quiet. Then he went to a box on the shelf behind the table and started looking. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Josephine hadn't expected. Not easy, exactly. Nothing about living on a mountain ranch in October was easy, but steady. Predictable in the way that working toward something gives your days a spine. She kept the records. She sorted through 4 months of land office correspondence and a year's worth of receipts and a contract dispute with a neighboring rancher that turned out to be a misunderstanding about fence line measurements she was able to resolve with a letter in one afternoon. She mapped what Silas owned against what the land office had recorded and found 3 discrepancies, all of them minor, all of them in the same direction. Small shavings of boundary, moving his property line south by degrees. Nothing dramatic enough to challenge outright. Just steady, patient erosion. It made her stomach go cold when she laid it all out on the table. "They've been doing this for 2 years, she said. Silas sat across from her, looking at the maps she'd drawn. "Yes. And if the northern boundary shifts even another 10 acres south, the upper pasture reads as unclaimed territory," he said. which means someone can file on it. Someone already has, she said, holding up the letter from the land office. He looked at it. Something moved through his face that she was starting to be able to read. The particular tightening around the eyes that meant he was angry, but the kind of angry that doesn't shout, that sits quietly in a man's chest and calculates. I need to go to Millhaven, he said. Not yet, she said. He looked at her. If you go now, you're one rancher with a complaint. Doss has people at that land office. A single complaint disappears. She tapped the map. But you said 3 properties changed hands. Those families, do you know them? Most of them. Then we need to talk to them first, she said, because I'm willing to bet their deeds have the same kind of irregularities, and one rancher's complaint is nothing, but 4 families saying the same thing. She stopped. That's a different conversation. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize, not the careful watchfulness he'd started with, not the measured politeness of the first few days, something more direct than that. You figured all of this out in a week, he said. I had good records to work with, she said, which was partially true and partially deflection, and she suspected he knew the difference. That's not what I mean, he said. She looked down at the map. I grew up watching Delphine manage debt, she said. The way she tracked it, how she used it. What people owe is how some people control what other people do. She smoothed a crease in the map with her thumb. I learned to read the patterns. He didn't say anything for a moment. I'm sorry, he said, that you had to learn that way. She looked up. His face was open in a way she hadn't seen before, without the usual careful management of expression. He meant it. He was just sorry, plainly, without any agenda attached to it. She didn't know what to do with that. She hadn't had much practice receiving genuine things. Don't be sorry, she said. It's useful now. She thought that would close the conversation, but he said quietly, It shouldn't have to be useful. You shouldn't have had to live like that. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind had picked up, coming down off the upper mountain with the smell of snow in it. No, she said. I shouldn't have. She paused. But here we are. He nodded, just that. They went back to the map. 2 days later, when she carried water from the well to the barn in the early morning and found one of the horses favoring her left foreleg, she went to get Silas without thinking twice. And she stood beside him in the cold while he ran his hands down the leg with a patience and gentleness that stopped her mid-sentence about the angle of the hoof. She watched his hands, the same hands she'd instinctively cataloged the first day. Large, scarred, the kind of hands that looked like they'd done damage. Doing something entirely different now. Careful and quiet, reading what the animal couldn't tell him in words. Easy, he said to the horse, low and even, not to Josephine. I know it hurts. Hold still. The horse, which had been shifting and nervous, went still. Josephine stood there in the cold with the empty water bucket and felt something shift in the architecture of her understanding. Not dramatically, not like a revelation, more like a slow adjustment of perspective, the way your eyes finally focus on something you've been looking at without seeing. She'd been watching for the monster. She'd been waiting for him to appear, for the mask to slip, for the reasonable behavior to crack open and show whatever was underneath. She'd been so focused on waiting for the hidden thing that she'd been only half seeing what was actually in front of her. A man who returned coins rather than accept a person as property. A man who kept a lock on a door and gave away the only key. A man who talked to a hurt horse like it deserved the reassurance. She wasn't naive. She knew that people were complicated, that decent behavior in one area didn't guarantee it in another, that she was still a stranger in this man's house and warranted a certain amount of careful attention to what was real. She didn't trust easily and she wasn't about to start. But she lowered the bucket and said, What do you need? He looked up briefly. There's a poultice kit on the 3rd shelf in the tack room. The cloth wrapping is already prepared. I'll get it, she said. She got it. They wrapped the horse's leg together, him holding and her wrapping under his direction. And at one point her hands were working 3 inches from his in the cramped cold of the stall, and neither of them said anything about it, and the horse stood patient and quiet between them. And it was so ordinary, so completely unremarkable, that Josephine almost laughed. Almost. She was laughing at herself, really, at how much energy she'd been spending preparing for something terrible, at how exhausting it was to always be braced, She didn't know yet that the terrible thing was coming. She just didn't know its name yet. Its name was Harlan Doss, and he had already sent men to the mountain. She found out 11 days after arriving at the ranch, on a Tuesday afternoon when Silas had ridden down to the Colbert place, one of the families who'd lost land, to begin the conversations Josephine had suggested. She was alone at the house, working through the final comparison of boundary documents when she heard horses on the road. She looked out the window. Two men she didn't know, well-dressed for the territory, sitting on horses that cost more than most people in Crooked Pine earned in a year. They stopped at the edge of the yard and didn't dismount. She went to the door. She did not open it all the way. "Mr. Calder's not here," she said. The man in front smiled. He had the particular smile of someone who's been hired to be pleasant before he's hired to be otherwise. "That's all right, miss. We're not here to see Calder." He looked at her steadily. "We're here to see you." Her hand was on the door. She kept it there. "I don't know you." "No, ma'am," he said. "But Mr. Doss knows you, and he wanted us to pass along a message." He reached into his coat and she went rigid. Then he produced only an envelope, which he held out toward her without moving closer. "He thought you might like to know the nature of your situation before things get complicated." She didn't take the envelope. "Leave it on the fence post," she said. "I'll read it when I choose." Something moved through the man's face, the pleasantness thinning slightly. "He also wanted me to say that the offer stands. He's willing to settle the debt your stepmother owes, clear your situation entirely, and set you up comfortable in town. All you'd need to do is come with us now before Calder gets back." The world went very quiet. She understood in that moment, with the kind of cold clarity she'd learned from years of living with Delphine, exactly what she was looking at. Not an offer, a removal. Doss didn't want her comfortable in town. Doss wanted her away from Silas's papers, away from Silas's records, away from the work she'd already done that was sitting on the table 20 feet behind her. She was the weakness. That was what Delphine had accidentally done by bringing her here. She'd given Doss something to use. A girl with no family and no standing, living on a mountain with a man the whole valley feared. Easy to take, easy to use as leverage, easy to make disappear. Her hands were steady. She was surprised by that. "Tell Mr. Doss," she said, her voice coming out level and even, "that I'm not a debt to be settled. I'm not a situation to be managed." She met the man's eyes directly. "And I'm not going anywhere." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it, listening to the horses, listening to the silence from the men outside, the small calculation happening in that silence. Then the sound of hooves moving, going back down the road. She stayed against the door until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she went to the table and sat down and put her hands flat on the papers in front of her, the maps, the deeds, the 4 months of correspondence she'd organized into something coherent, and she breathed. She was shaking. She noticed that only now, after the door was closed, a fine tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with cold. She pressed her palms flat until it stopped. When Silas came back an hour later, she told him everything. She told him about the men, the envelope she hadn't touched, the offer, the exact words. She watched his face go through several things in quick succession: alarm, anger, then something colder and more focused than either. He picked up the envelope from the fence post where she'd told him to look, read it without expression, set it down on the table. "He knows you've been working on the records," he said. "He knows enough to want me gone," she said, "which means he knows enough to be worried." She looked at the papers on the table. "We're closer than I thought." "Josephine." He said her name with a weight to it that made her look up. "This isn't your fight." She looked at him for a long moment. At the scar, the gray temples, the leg that hurt more than he ever said, the man who'd returned 32 coins rather than buy a person. "You gave me a key," she said, "to a room in your house. You paid me wages for 11 days of work. You have not once, in 11 days, treated me like I was less than what I am." She put the envelope on top of the deed pile. "I've had exactly one person in my life do those things. You." She kept her eyes on his. "So don't tell me it's not my fight. You don't get to do all that and then tell me to stand aside." The fire snapped. Silas looked at her for a long time with that unreadable expression that she was slowly learning to read. Then he sat down across from her, pulled the map toward him, and said, "Tell me where we are." She told him. And they worked until the fire burned low and the wind came hard off the upper mountain, and outside in the dark the pines moved and groaned against each other. And somewhere down in the valley, Harlan Doss was waiting to see if his message had landed. It had landed, just not the way he'd intended. Part 3. The Secret Beneath the Mountain. The Colbert family lived 3 miles down the South Road in a house that had started as 2 rooms and grown outward over 30 years as children arrived, and the land demanded more of the people working it. Silas had known Walt Colbert since before the war. They weren't close. Silas wasn't close with anyone by design. But they were the kind of neighbors who helped each other with fence line and didn't ask for accounting afterward. That was its own kind of bond out here. Walt Colbert met them at the gate with a shotgun, not raised, just carried, broken open over his forearm, the way a man carries a weapon when he wants you to know it exists without making a direct threat. He was in his 60s, thick through the chest, with a white beard he hadn't trimmed in a while, and eyes that had gone careful in a way eyes go when a man has been scared for long enough that it starts to look like suspicion. "Silas," he said. Then his eyes moved to Josephine, sitting the horse beside Silas, and stayed there a moment with a question in them. "This is Josephine Merritt," Silas said. "She's been going through my land office correspondence. She found some things you need to hear." Walt looked at her for another moment. She looked back at him without dropping her eyes. Then he stepped aside and they rode through the gate. The inside of the Colbert house was the inside of a house where fear had been living for a while. The kind of fear that doesn't announce itself. It shows in the stack of papers on the kitchen table that someone keeps going back to but can't resolve. In the way Walt's wife Nora poured coffee without being asked, and then stood in the doorway of the kitchen like she needed to be near an exit. In the way the 2 youngest Colbert children, maybe 8 and 10, sat in the corner of the room doing nothing, which is what children do when they've absorbed their parents' tension and have nowhere to put it. Josephine spread her copied documents on the kitchen table. She didn't preamble. She'd learned from Silas that the most effective way to tell someone something hard is to just tell them. "Your eastern boundary," she said, pointing to the survey line she'd mapped. "In the deed registered 23 years ago, it runs to the creek at marker 7. In the land office records from 18 months ago, it runs to marker 5. She looked up. "That's 40 acres. Gone. On paper." Walt Colbert stared at the map. His jaw worked. He looked at Silas. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "I knew it. But every time I went to the land office, they showed me records. But their records," Josephine said. "Not yours. Do you have your original deed?" "Somewhere," Walt said. He was already moving to a box on a high shelf. "Nora, where did we—" "Top shelf, the tin box," Nora said from the doorway. Her voice was controlled in the way of a woman who has been controlling her voice for a while. The original deed was there, and it said exactly what Josephine's survey copy said it should say. "Then you have proof," she said. "The original supersedes their amended record. If we can get this in front of the right people, so—" "The land office is the right people," Walt said, "and the land office answers to Doss." "The land office in Mill Haven answers to the territory," Josephine said, "and the territory answers to federal authority." She paused. "If we have multiple families with original deeds showing the same pattern of amendment—" "There are more," Nora said from the doorway. Everyone looked at her. She came into the room properly now, drying her hands on her apron, something having shifted in her expression from watchful to decided. "The Prentice family, the Acree widow, probably the Hannigan place too, though they've already been pushed off." She sat down at the table. "We've been talking to each other for months. We just didn't know what we were looking at." Josephine looked at Silas. He was watching Nora Colbert with an expression she recognized now, the particular respect he had for people who kept themselves together under pressure. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Then we need to talk to all of them," Josephine said. They spent 4 days writing. 4 days of cold roads and kitchen tables and original deeds pulled from tin boxes and old trunks, and in the case of the widow Acree, a false bottom in a flour barrel where she'd hidden everything she considered irreplaceable after Doss's men had come through her property the previous spring, asking questions with too many teeth in them. Eleanor Cree was 71 years old and lived alone and was one of the sharpest people Josephine had ever sat across a table from. She'd been a school teacher in her first life, before marriage and land and loss had redirected everything, and she looked at Josephine's compiled documents with the focused attention of someone who graded papers for a living. "You're missing something," she said after 10 minutes of silence. "What?" Josephine said. "The Silver Survey." She said it flatly, like a fact on a blackboard. 19 years ago, a mining surveyor came through this valley, privately contracted, took samples from the creek beds, the upper pastures, 3 or 4 properties. She looked at Silas. "Including yours." Silas had gone very still. "I remember," he said. "I thought he was a water surveyor, looking at drainage for the Territory Road project." "He wasn't," Eleanor said. "My husband knew what he actually was. He didn't say anything because he was worried about what would happen if word got out." She folded her hands on the table. "Silver, Mr. Calder. Significant deposits. Beneath the northern pastures of at least 4 properties in this valley." She paused. "Including yours. Especially yours." The room was quiet for a long time. Josephine looked at the map in front of her, the one she'd spent days compiling, with its careful notations of contested boundaries, its records of Doss's slow, patient erosion of property lines. She looked at the pattern she'd been reading as financial manipulation and felt the whole picture rearrange itself into something much larger. "He's not after the land," she said. "He's after what's under it." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He needed the deed records changed before the silver became known," Josephine said. "If he can establish that those properties were always smaller than, or unclaimed, he can file mining rights without challenge." She put her finger on the northern boundary of Silas's property on the map. "This is why they filed the competing claim. This exact 20 acres. The richest part of the deposit," Eleanor said quietly. "According to what my husband was told." Silas stood up from the table and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to them, and Josephine watched the set of his shoulders and understood that he was absorbing something that had just rewritten a significant portion of the last 2 years of his life. The letters from the land office, the men who'd come to buy his property, the growing pressure from every direction. It had never been about grazing rights or water access. It had always been about what was underneath. "Doss has been planning this for years," he said. He wasn't asking. He was saying it out loud to make it real. "At least 4, Eleanor said. "Maybe longer." He turned around. His face was controlled, but there was something underneath it she'd only seen once before. In the barn, with the hurt horse, when he'd thought she wasn't watching, the look of a man dealing with pain he wasn't going to mention. "All right," he said, "then we know what we're up against." They stayed at Eleanor Cree's house that night, because the ride back was too long to make in the dark, and Eleanor had spare rooms and seemed to welcome the company in the quiet way of someone who would never say so directly. After supper, while Silas was outside tending the horses, Eleanor sat across from Josephine with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking and looked at her with a directness that was somewhat startling. "How long have you been at the Calder Ranch?" she asked. 3 weeks, Josephine said. "And before that?" "Crooked Pine," Josephine said. "My stepmother's house." Eleanor nodded. Something in her expression said she already knew most of this, or at least the shape of it. Small valleys talked. "You were the girl in the square," she said. 3 weeks ago." It wasn't quite a question. Josephine kept her face even. "Yes." "And now you're here," Eleanor said, "with his land records and his deed copies and a map that took someone with a real mind to put together." A pause. "Does he know what he has in you?" Josephine felt heat come into her face that she didn't entirely control. "We have an employment arrangement," she said. "I keep records." "I wasn't asking about employment," Eleanor said mildly, and took a sip of her tea like she hadn't just said anything in particular. Josephine said nothing for a moment, then, "I don't know what he knows. I know what the situation is." She looked at her hands. which is that a powerful man wants something that belongs to him and has been moving against it for years, and that I happen to have skills that are useful right now. Skills that are useful right now, Eleanor repeated, not mockingly, just holding the words up to look at them. You're a bit like him, you know. Josephine looked up. What do you mean? Calder, Eleanor said. He never talks about what a thing means, only what needs to be done about it. She set down her cup. It can be a strength. It can also be a way of not saying things that should be said. She stood, collecting the cups, conversation apparently concluded on her terms. Good night, Josephine. Josephine sat alone at the table for a while after that. The next morning, they rode back toward the mountain with copies of 3 deeds, Eleanor's testimony written out in her precise schoolteacher hand, and enough documentation to begin making a real case. Not a finished case, not a winning case, but the bones of one. It was more than they'd had a week ago. It was also, Josephine understood, exactly the kind of thing that would make Harlan Doss move faster. She was right about that, as it turned out. They were 2 hours from the ranch when Silas said, without preamble, I need to tell you something. She looked at him sideways. His eyes were on the road. The men I killed, he said, the story that went around about me. She didn't say anything. She waited. 12 years ago, he said, there was a family living up near the North Pass, the Reed family, a man and his wife and 2 children, youngest one maybe 4 years old. He was quiet for a moment. 3 men showed up at their place in November. Travelers, or that's what they said. The husband let them stay in the barn. A pause, longer this time. I was coming down from the upper pasture and I heard the wife screaming. The road went on ahead of them. The pines moved in the wind. I stopped them, he said. The 3 men. It wasn't... He stopped, started again. It wasn't clean. It wasn't something I planned out. The youngest child was hurt. The husband was unconscious. I did what I did, and there was no undoing it. His voice was completely flat, the kind of flat that comes from having said something to yourself so many times that the emotion has worn off the words. But by the time the town heard about it, it was a different story. 3 men dead on a mountain rancher's property. The Reedy family left the valley 6 months later. Without them to tell it right, the story just became what people wanted it to be. Josephine looked at the road. Did you ever try to correct it? She asked. A pause. Once, he said. First year. Went into town and told the truth to anyone who'd listen. He was quiet. Didn't change anything. People had already decided, and after a while I figured... He stopped again, and she could hear him choosing words carefully. If they thought I was dangerous, they'd leave me alone. And I had land I needed to work, and I was tired of explaining myself to people who'd already made up their minds. So you let them be afraid of you, she said. Yes. Because it was easier than the alternative. Yes. She thought about that. About a man who chose to be hated over being disbelieved, and how much of himself he'd had to put away to make that choice, and how many years he'd been carrying the weight of it in that careful silence of his. The Reed family, she said. Do you know where they went? He glanced at her. South. Last I heard, Missouri territory. Then they can't speak for you, she said, but Eleanor Cree can, and the Colberts, and every family in this valley who's watched Doss's men come through their property with smiles on their faces and legal papers in their hands. She held his gaze. The story was wrong. It doesn't have to stay wrong. He looked at the road again, said nothing, but something in his shoulders changed, a small release, barely visible, like a man setting down something he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it had weight. They were within sight of the ranch when they saw the smoke. Not from the chimney, from the barn. Silas had the horse running before Josephine fully registered what she was seeing, and she pushed hers after him, and they came into the yard at a dead run to find the barn's south wall burning and one of the horses frantic in the paddock and the second horse already gone. Silas was off his horse before it fully stopped, bad leg or not, moving toward the barn, and Josephine was 3 seconds behind him calling his name because the wall was going and the roof was catching and going in was already a bad idea and becoming a worse one. The bay is in there, he said, not stopping. She grabbed his arm. Silas, stop. She's in there. Look at the paddock. She pulled him around to face it. The bay mare was in the paddock, already loose, already outside, nervous and blowing, but standing. She's out. She's already out. Someone let her out. He stopped. He looked at the paddock. The bay was there, both horses accounted for, both alive. Someone let her out, she said again, more quietly. Before they lit the fire. He looked at the burning barn, and she watched him understand what she already had. This was a message, not a massacre. Doss's men had been here. They could have hurt the animals, could have done considerably worse, and they hadn't. They'd let the horses out and burned the barn and left, which meant they were being told something. He's escalating, Silas said. Yes. He's not ready to destroy things permanently yet, she said. He's showing us he can. That's different. She watched the barn wall collapse inward with a sound like a long exhalation. He wants us to make a decision. What decision? Leave, she said, or stay and find out what comes after a warning. They put the fire out, what was left of the barn, which wasn't much, but they stopped it from reaching the house, the two of them working the water line until their arms gave out, and the worst of it was ash and nothing more. When it was done, they stood in the yard in the cold and the dark, covered in soot and sweat, and Silas looked at what was left of the barn, and his face was something beyond anger now, something past the controlled calculations she'd watched him manage for weeks. He was at the end of something. She could see it. I'm going to Doss, he said. No, she said. Josephine? Not yet. She stood in front of him. She was smaller than him by a significant margin, and she was aware of that, and it didn't matter. Not like this. You go to him angry and alone, and he will use it. He will make you into the monster they already want you to be. She held his gaze. We have 3 weeks of work on that table. We have the deeds. We have Eleanor's testimony. We have almost enough. Almost, he said, the word like gravel. Almost isn't nothing, she said. We need 2 more things. The Hannigan family, if we can find them, and someone at the territory level who will listen. She held her ground. Give me 1 more week. He looked at the ruined barn, at the horses standing in the paddock, still unsettled, still blowing nervous steam into the cold air, at the house, intact, the light from the window spilling yellow onto the yard. 1 week, he said. 1 week, she said. He bent down and picked up a burned piece of timber from the edge of the ash and turned it over in his hands, not for any reason except that his hands needed something to do. She understood that. She felt it in her own hands, the need for action, for something to push against. I didn't tell you the other part, he said, still looking at the timber. What other part? About that night 12 years ago. He set the timber down. The youngest Reed child, the 4-year-old. He paused. She took a cut to the arm, bad one. I stopped the bleeding, sat with her until she could sleep. He looked up. I don't tell people that part. I don't know why I'm telling you. She looked at him, at the soot on his face and the gray in his hair and the way he stood with the weight slightly off the bad leg, holding the kind of honesty that costs something. Because it matters, she said. That's why. He looked at her for a moment longer than usual. Then he looked away, up at the mountain above them, at the dark shape of it against the night sky. 1 week, he said again, quieter this time. 1 week, she said. They went inside. The fire was still going in the hearth, untouched by what had happened outside, warm and ordinary and completely indifferent to the state of things. Josephine went to the table and looked at the map, the deeds, the weeks of careful work. She touched the edge of Eleanor Acree's testimony with 1 finger. Almost enough. Almost. The thought that kept circling in the back of her mind was not about Doss or the land or the silver beneath the northern pasture. It was about a 4-year-old child with a cut on her arm and a man sitting beside her in the dark until she could sleep, and how that man had spent 12 years letting the valley think he was a monster, rather than admit he was something else entirely. She didn't know what to do with that information. She only knew it changed things. Outside, the wind came down hard off the upper mountain, carrying the smell of snow and ash together, and somewhere in the dark the horses moved in the paddock, and Harlan Doss sat in his bank in Crooked Pine, calculating what came next, and the week Josephine had asked for began. It was 4 days later, on a Thursday morning when the first snow of the season was coming down in thin flurries, that they heard hoofbeats on the road again. Silas was at the window first, and she saw his hand move toward the rifle on the wall and then stop. "It's not his men," he said. It was a girl. 17, maybe 18, on a horse she'd ridden too hard in cold weather, the animal blowing and the girl barely holding on. She came through the gate at a stumbling trot and half fell from the saddle in the yard, and Silas was out the door before Josephine had her coat on. By the time she got outside, the girl was on her feet, breathing hard, clutching Silas's arm with both hands. She was wearing a dress too thin for the weather, and her face was white with cold, and something else, something worse than cold. Josephine looked at the girl's face. She knew that face. "Priscilla," she said. Her stepsister looked up. Her eyes went wide and then flooded with something that was relief and terror in equal measure. "Joe," she said. "Joe, I rode all night. Doss, he's coming. He told the sheriff this morning. He's coming with 10 men and he's going to—" She stopped, catching her breath, hands still gripping Silas's arm like it was the only solid thing in the world. "He's not going to just scare you this time. He said, I heard him. I was in the hall. He didn't know I was there. He said he wants Calder in the ground and the girl gone before the week is out." The snow came down, thin and quiet and completely indifferent. Josephine looked at Silas. He was already looking at her. 1 week, she'd said. They had until morning. Part 4. The day the monster faced the valley. Priscilla stopped shaking somewhere around midnight. Not because she was warm. The fire was going, and Josephine had put the spare wool coat around her shoulders and made her drink 2 cups of coffee so hot it was almost painful. But because she'd run out of the particular energy that fear burns through a body, and what was left was just exhaustion and the aftermath of a long night ride in cold weather on a horse she'd borrowed without asking. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the mug and told them everything she knew. Doss had been in the bank that afternoon with Sheriff Greel and 2 men Priscilla didn't recognize, and they'd been in the back office with the door mostly closed. And Priscilla had been sweeping the hallway because Delphine had a contract cleaning arrangement with the bank that Priscilla was the one who actually fulfilled. She'd heard enough. She'd finished sweeping, put the broom away, gone home, waited until Delphine was asleep, and left. "Your mother's going to know you're gone by dawn," Josephine said. "She's not my mother," Priscilla said. She said it quietly, without drama, just a correction. "And yes, she will." She looked up at Josephine. "I don't care. I'm not going back." Silas was at the window. He'd been at the window for most of the last hour, looking out at the dark yard, the tree line, the road. Not because he expected Doss's men tonight, as Priscilla had said morning, and she'd been clear about that, but because standing at a window gave him something to look at while his mind worked. Josephine knew what he was thinking because she was thinking the same thing. They had the documents. They had the testimony. They had the depositions from the Colbert family and Eleanor Cree and the widow Prentice. And they had almost enough to make a case that would hold up in front of territory authority. He said even if you had papers, he controlled the land office records, and nobody in Millhaven was going to take a mountain rancher's word over a banker's. She paused. And he said— She stopped, looking at Josephine. "Say it," Josephine said. "He said the girl was the loose end. That's what he called you, the loose end." Priscilla's jaw tightened. "He said once she's removed from the situation, Calder has nothing because a man with a reputation like his doesn't get believed without somebody credible standing beside him." The fire cracked. Josephine looked at the table. At the maps and deeds and testimonies she'd spent weeks building into something coherent. She looked at Eleanor Cree's handwriting, precise and schoolteacherly across the page. She looked at Walt Colbert's deed with the original boundary markers still clear and unambiguous. She had been reduced again to a loose end, a variable to be removed so the equation worked the way someone else wanted it to. The anger that moved through her was different from anything she'd felt in the square 3 weeks ago. That had been hot and immediate, the anger of pure humiliation. This was colder, more specific. The anger of a person who has been underestimated so many times that the underestimating itself has become instructive. "He's wrong," she said. Silas turned from the window. "He thinks removing me leaves you with nothing," she said, "because he thinks I'm the credibility, the presentable face, the person who makes the papers make sense." She stood up from the table. "He doesn't understand what we actually have. He's never seen the full picture because he doesn't think I built a full picture. He thinks I'm a girl who organized some files." "What are you saying?" Silas asked. "I'm saying we go to him," she said. "Not away from him. To him. To the town." He was quiet for a moment. "Josephine, he's coming here to control the story," she said. 10 men and the sheriff. He comes to this mountain, he has witnesses to whatever happens, and all of them are his. He sets the scene. He decides what it looks like. She put her hands flat on the table. "But if we go to the town before he leaves it, the witnesses are everyone. Every family in Crooked Pine. Every person who was standing in that square 3 weeks ago and looked the other way." She held his gaze. "We take away his stage, and we put the truth on it instead." Priscilla was watching Josephine with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between fear and something that was almost admiration, with a layer of exhaustion over it all. "That's insane," Priscilla said. "Yes," Josephine said, "but it's the move he isn't ready for. He's been prepared for us to run or to fight from here. He is not prepared for us to walk into town in front of everybody and start talking." Silas looked at the table. He looked at the window. He looked at Josephine. "If it goes wrong," he started. "If it goes wrong, we were going to lose anyway," she said. "He has 10 men and the sheriff and 4 years of planted groundwork. We can't outmuscle that. We never could." She paused. "But he built his whole structure on people not knowing the truth, on silence, on nobody comparing their deed to their neighbor's deed." She touched the edge of Eleanor's testimony. "The one thing he hasn't prepared for is a room full of people who all find out at once." The silence stretched. Outside, the snow had stopped. The yard was faintly pale with what had fallen, and the tree line was black against a sky beginning its slow approach toward dawn. Silas picked up Eleanor Cree's testimony and read it again. He already knew what it said. He read it anyway. "We'd need to leave before first light," he said. "Yes," she said. He set the testimony down. "Priscilla, can you write again?" The girl looked startled to be addressed directly. Then she straightened, both hands still on the mug, and said, "Yes." "All right," he said. He said it the way he said most things, quiet, final, without drama. Then he went to get his coat. They rode out at 4 in the morning, 3 horses on a dark road, the cold working through every layer of clothing Josephine owned. She'd packed the documents in an oilskin satchel she'd found in the tack room that still smelled of ash and the burned barn. And she kept it across her lap with one hand on it, even though the road was dry and there was no real risk of dropping it. It just needed to be held onto. She needed something solid under her hand. Priscilla rode between them. She didn't talk, which Josephine respected. Some situations don't benefit from conversation, and a 4-hour ride toward something you might not survive is one of them. Silas set the pace. Steady, not fast. A horse pushed hard on a cold road for 4 hours was a horse that might not hold up when it mattered, and Josephine noticed that he thought of things like that, the practical upstream considerations, the things that didn't seem connected to the immediate problem but were actually the infrastructure of it. She'd been noticing that about him for weeks. The careful way he planned. Nothing showy about it, just competent and quiet and thorough. She'd been noticing a lot of things about him, if she was honest. She'd been trying not to think too directly about that. They came into Crooked Pine as the sun was clearing the eastern ridge, the light long and thin and pale, hitting the main street at an angle that made everything look both ordinary and exposed. A few people were out. The general store owner sweeping his steps, a woman with a market basket, 2 men by the livery talking over a horse's back. All of them stopped when they saw who was riding in. Not because of the 3 of them, exactly. Because of Silas Calder. Because the scarred mountain rancher who never came to town unless he needed something from the hardware store was riding in at sunrise on a cold morning with a young woman and a girl, and he looked like a man who'd made a decision. Josephine had chosen the square deliberately. The same square. She wasn't sure if that was strategy or something more personal, but it didn't matter. The square was where things happened in Crooked Pine. It was where people gathered when something was worth gathering for. She rode in first, not because she'd planned to, but because when Silas slowed near the entrance to the square, she kept going, and she heard his horse fall in behind her, and she pulled up in the middle of the square and just waited. It took about 4 minutes for enough people to notice. That was all it took in a town this size. One person stopping and looking, then another, then the particular human domino of attention that occurs when something is clearly about to happen in a public space. They came out of shops and out of doorways, and some of them she recognized. Mrs. Hargrove from her bench, same folded hands. And some were strangers to her, and in about 4 minutes there were 40-odd people standing at the edges of the square, looking at the three of them in the middle of it. Josephine opened the satchel. "My name is Josephine Merritt," she said. Her voice came out louder than she expected, clearer. "Some of you saw me standing here 3 weeks ago when my stepmother offered me to this man as payment for a debt." She held the satchel against her chest. "I want to start by telling you that what you saw that day was wrong, and every one of you who watched it happen and said nothing was also wrong." A murmur went through the crowd, not hostile, uncomfortable. The sound of a room of people hearing something true that they'd been avoiding. "I also want to tell you," she continued, "that this man, Silas Calder, refused the arrangement. He refused it in front of all of you. He offered me honest work and a choice. Some of you saw that too." She looked at Mrs. Hargrove, who met her eyes for the first time. "I want you to remember you saw it, because in about an hour, someone is going to try to tell you a different version of who he is." She opened the satchel and held up the first document. "I've spent 3 weeks on this man's ranch going through land office records," she said. "What I found is this," she told them. She'd been afraid on the ride down that she would be too nervous to do it clearly, that the fear would make her stumble over the details and lose the thread. She didn't. She was precise, and she was plain, and she went through it in order the way she'd learned from Eleanor Cree, who taught children for a living and understood that truth needs a structure people can follow. She named properties. She named families. She held up documents and explained what the original deed said, and what the amended land office record said, and what the difference between them meant in terms of acreage and legal ownership in the silver deposit that sat beneath a significant portion of this valley and that Harlan Doss had known about for years. People were very quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't passive. The kind that happens when a crowd is actively processing something that's rearranging what they thought they knew. And then Silas stepped his horse forward. He didn't do what she'd expected, which was speak immediately. He held the reins loosely and looked at the crowd for a moment, taking them in, and she realized he was nervous. Not in a way that showed clearly, but she knew his face well enough now to read the small tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw was set. "I killed 3 men 12 years ago," he said. No preamble, no softening. "On my property, in November, at night. That's true. Most of you know some version of it." He looked around the square. "What you don't know is why. Because the family I protected left this valley, and I let the story stay wrong because it suited me to be left alone." He told them. Shorter than Josephine had expected, plainer, without embellishment or self-pity. The Reed family, the 3 men, the youngest child with the cut on her arm. He told it the way he'd told it to her on the road, flat and unadorned and carrying the particular weight of something a person has carried alone for a very long time. When he finished, the square was completely silent. Then Walt Colbert stepped out of the crowd. He'd been there. Josephine saw him now, near the back, Nora at his side. He walked into the square and stood next to Silas's horse and turned to face the crowd. "He came to my house 2 weeks ago," Walt said. "Him and this girl. Showed me my own deed against what the land office has on record." He paused. 40 acres I've been farming for 23 years. Gone on paper. I didn't know until she laid it out on my kitchen table." Eleanor Cree's voice came from the edge of the crowd. She'd ridden in sometime in the night, apparently, because she was there in her good coat with her hands folded in front of her. "I can corroborate both the land records and the nature of the original silver survey," she said, in the voice of a woman addressing a school board. "I have documentation. The Widow Prentice, The Colbert boys. One by one, the people Josephine and Silas had spent 3 weeks talking to stepped into the square. It was not a clean or triumphant moment. Two people near the back were arguing about something she couldn't hear. A man in a merchant's apron was shaking his head like he didn't believe any of it. Mrs. Hargrove was crying quietly into her hands, though whether from guilt or relief or something else entirely, Josephine couldn't say. And then the sound she'd been listening for, hoofbeats, coming from the East Road, multiple horses. Harlan Doss came into the square with 8 men. Not 10, 2 fewer than Priscilla had heard mentioned, which meant either the number had changed or Priscilla had miscounted in the dark, and Sheriff Greal riding at his side with a face that was doing the complicated work of looking official while avoiding everyone's eyes. Doss was a man in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the way of men who want their prosperity to be visible, with a full gray beard trimmed close and eyes that moved quickly across the scene in front of him and calculated. Josephine watched him take in the crowd, the documents she was still holding, the people standing in the square who were not supposed to be there. He recovered quickly. She gave him that. "Calder," he said. His voice was even and carried a practiced authority. "I'm glad you've saved us a trip to the mountain. Sheriff Greal has a warrant for your arrest." "On what charge?" Silas said. "Intimidation, fraud, threatening behavior toward employees of the Doss Financial Trust." He looked at Josephine. "And harboring a runaway. The girl standing beside you belongs to a household in this town." "I don't belong to anyone," Josephine said. She heard her own voice come out clean and clear and was briefly surprised by it. "You were placed in service," Doss started. "I was offered as debt payment," she said. "In this square, 3 weeks ago, in front of everyone standing here right now." She looked around the crowd deliberately. "You all know what happened. You saw it." She looked back at Doss. "And you know what happened after, Mr. Doss. You sent men to the mountain. They burned his barn." She held up the oilskin satchel. "And then you sent them again with an offer to make me go away, because you knew what I'd found in those records." Doss's face did something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not fear, just a kind of cool reassessment. He was recalculating. She could see it happening. "The land records in Mill Haven are official territory documents," he said. "Whatever this girl has assembled is private speculation by someone with no legal standing." "Eleanor A. Cree has legal standing," Josephine said. "She's a property owner in this valley, and she has her original deed, and she has a written account of the silver survey conducted 19 years ago." She paused. "So does Walt Colbert. So does Margaret Prentice. So do 4 other families in this valley." She opened the satchel and began placing documents on the bench beside her, one by one. "This isn't speculation. This is evidence. And we have enough of it that a federal inquiry will find something worth looking at." Doss's jaw tightened. "Not much. Just enough." "Federal inquiry," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, a flatness, an over-controlled flatness, that told her she'd landed somewhere that hurt. On the word of a mountain rancher and a girl with no family name worth mentioning. On the word of 8 families and a former school teacher, Eleanor Cree said from the edge of the crowd. "And I'll mention my name as often as necessary, Mr. Doss. I taught half the children in this valley. They know my handwriting." Doss looked at the crowd. He was doing the math that powerful men do in public moments. How many people? How much noise? How much of this could be contained? His eyes moved from face to face, and what they found was not the passive silence of the usual Crooked Pine public. What they found was people looking back. "Sheriff," he said, "the warrant." Greal shifted in his saddle. He didn't move toward Silas. He held very still, actually, in the way of a man who has been riding alongside a powerful person and has just realized the direction things are going. "Bill," Silas said quietly. He used the sheriff's first name, which surprised Josephine. She hadn't known they knew each other that way. "You've been sheriff here for 11 years. You know every family in this valley. You've sat at Walt Colbert's table." He looked at the man directly. "This is the moment, right now. You know what's in those documents." Greal's face went through something complicated and not particularly dignified. He was not a bad man, Josephine thought, watching him. Just a man who'd been in the easier position for long enough that taking the harder one felt like being asked to walk off a ledge. "Doss," Greel said finally. His voice was rough. "I need to see those papers before I execute anything." Doss turned to look at him with an expression that could have cut glass. "Bill, I need to see them," Greel said, more firmly. The firmness of a man who has made a decision he knows he'll have to live with either way and has just chosen which version of himself he's willing to be. That's what the law says. I see the evidence before I make an arrest. The moment hung there, and then hoofbeats again from the West Road this time. Everyone turned. A single rider. A man Josephine didn't recognize. In a coat she did. The kind of coat that said Federal Territory Office. The particular cut of it. The badge on the chest. He pulled up at the edge of the square and looked around at the assembled crowd and the horses and the documents on the bench with the expression of a man who has ridden 4 hours to find something and has arrived to find it already in progress. He said, "I'm looking for a Silas Calder. I'm Marshal Daniel Hess, Territorial Authority, Millhaven. I received a correspondence 3 weeks ago regarding irregularities in the Regional Land Office records." He looked around. "I apologize for the delay. The roads from the south were washed out." Josephine closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. 3 weeks ago. The letter she'd written the night after Doss's men first came to the mountain. The one she'd given to the Colbert boys to carry to Millhaven on their next supply run. The one she hadn't told Silas about because she hadn't wanted to give him something to hope for that might not come. She'd written it and sent it, and then continued building the case as if it wasn't coming, because it might not have been. She opened her eyes. Silas was looking at her. She met his gaze. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He looked at her for a long moment with something in his face she hadn't seen before and couldn't name exactly. Something that was past gratitude, past surprise, past the careful managed distance he kept between himself and most things. Then he looked at Marshal Hess. "Right here," he said. What followed was not elegant. It was not the clean collapse of a villain's empire that stories sometimes describe. It was hours of cold air and tense conversation, and Greel eventually dismounting and standing closer to Marshal Hess than to Doss, and Doss's 8 men looking at each other and gradually understanding that the situation had shifted in a way that made their guns not only unnecessary, but actively inadvisable. Doss's lawyer arrived from somewhere. He'd apparently been in Crooked Pine already, which told Josephine that Doss had expected some form of confrontation today and had prepared for a legal aftermath. The lawyer looked at the assembled documents and Eleanor Acree's expression and said something in a low voice to Doss that made Doss go still. Josephine sat on the bench beside her documents and watched. Priscilla sat next to her, close, their shoulders touching in the cold, and Josephine was aware of her stepsister's warmth beside her without making anything of it. It was just warmth, just someone there. The forged deeds unraveled faster than she'd expected, because Marshal Hess had already been looking. Her letter had started something in Millhaven 3 weeks ago. A quiet audit. Someone pulling original records and comparing them to the amended versions. And what they'd found had been enough to justify the ride. The Silver Survey documentation, once Eleanor produced it and it was confirmed against territory mining records, made the motive undeniable. Doss was not arrested that morning. That was the part that felt most real and most unsatisfying. The law moved like everything moves, slowly, with paperwork and process and the careful building of a case that would hold. He was told not to leave Crooked Pine. His men left. His lawyer was talking in a low, urgent voice, and Doss was listening with his face arranged into the careful stillness of a man who still believes he has moves left to make. Maybe he did. Josephine didn't know. What she knew was that the story was out now, in the open, in front of the whole valley. You couldn't put that back. Whatever Doss could arrange with lawyers and process, he couldn't arrange the unhearing of a square full of people who now knew about the silver and the deeds and the 4 years of careful theft. She felt Silas come to stand beside her at the edge of the square. He didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at his profile, the scar, the jaw, the gray at the temples. "The letter," he said. Not accusatory, just asking. 3 weeks ago, she said, the night after his men came with the offer. I didn't tell you because I didn't know if it would come to anything. He was quiet. Are you angry? She asked. Another pause. No, he said. He stopped, started again. I don't have a word for what I am. That's all right, she said. You sent a letter to the territory marshal on behalf of a man you'd known for 11 days, he said, without telling him. I sent a letter because it was the right thing to do, she said, and because I'd known you long enough to know your case was real. She looked at him. And because you would have told me not to bother, that it wouldn't come to anything, you would have been practical about it. He looked back at her. Something in his face had given up on being carefully managed. Yes, he said, I would have. So I didn't ask, she said. They stood there. The square was still busy, people talking, Hess and Greel in a corner going through papers. The Colbert family gathered in a group with the prentice woman, Priscilla sitting on the bench eating something someone had brought her from the bakery across the street. Walt Colbert came over and put out his hand and Silas shook it. Eleanor Cree came over and looked at Josephine with that direct schoolteacher gaze and said, well done, and then moved on without waiting for a response, which was exactly the right call. Josephine looked at the town around her, at the square where she'd stood 3 weeks ago with nothing. No choices, no standing, no one willing to speak. She looked at the bench where the documents were laid out, at the marshal reading them in the thin winter sunlight, at Doss across the square with his lawyer and his stillness and his empire already starting to come apart at the seams. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired mostly, and cold, and something underneath the tired that she couldn't name yet. Something quieter, something that had to do with the fact that she was still standing in this square. But standing was different now. She had chosen to stand here. That was the difference. That was all the difference there was. Priscilla appeared at her elbow, still eating, cheeks pink from the cold. What happens now? She asked. Josephine looked at Silas. He was still beside her, still just standing there, which was its own kind of answer. Now, Josephine said, we go home. She didn't say whose home, but when Silas heard it, something in his face did what faces do when a word lands exactly where it was meant to. Part 5. The Mountain Man's True Legacy. The ride back to the mountain took longer than the ride down, not because the horses were slower, though they were tired, because nobody was in a hurry anymore, and that itself felt strange. The absence of urgency after weeks of nothing but urgency, like stepping out of a loud room into sudden quiet and not quite trusting it yet. Priscilla rode on the left, Josephine in the middle, Silas on the right. The sun had moved past noon and the light was coming down through the pines at an angle that turned everything amber and cold. Nobody talked much for the first hour. There wasn't much to say that the day hadn't already said. It was Priscilla who broke the silence, which did not surprise Josephine. Her stepsister had always been the one who couldn't let quiet sit too long. What happens to Doss? She asked. Territory court, Silas said. Hess will build the case through the winter. The land office records, the forged amendments, the mining survey, that's federal interference with property rights. That's not a fine and a handshake. Will he go to prison? Silas was quiet for a moment. That depends on how good his lawyer is, he said, and how many people are willing to testify. He glanced at Josephine. Eleanor Cree will testify. Walt Colbert will. That's enough to start. He might still find a way out, Josephine said. She wasn't being pessimistic. She was being accurate, and she thought Priscilla was old enough to hear accuracy. Men like Doss have resources we don't. But even if he finds a way to reduce the charges, the land is the land. Hess already flagged the amended records for reversal. The families get their boundaries back. Priscilla absorbed this. And the silver? That's a different conversation, Silas said. For a different day. It was, in fact, a conversation Josephine had been turning over in her mind since Eleanor Cree had said the word silver in that schoolteacher's flat voice, and the whole picture had rearranged itself. The deposit beneath the northern pasture, beneath the 20 acres Doss had tried to claim through the competing filing, was on Silas's land. Legitimately, legally, unambiguously. Once the competing claim was voided, which Hess had already begun the process of doing, what sat under that ground belonged to Silas Calder. She didn't know what he intended to do with that. She hadn't asked yet. They reached the ranch in the late afternoon. The house was exactly as they'd left it. Fire burned down to coals, papers on the table, the smell of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular lived-in smell of a place that had recently had 3 people in it instead of 1. The ruined barn sat at the edge of the yard, its ash walls open to the sky, looking like a wound that was already beginning to scar over. Silas started the fire. Josephine made coffee. Priscilla stood in the kitchen doorway looking around the main room with the careful attention of someone cataloging a new place, deciding what she thought of it. "You can have the room," Josephine said, without looking up from the stove. Priscilla looked at her. "Which room?" "The one I've been using." She poured water into the pot. "I'll move my things. It won't take long. I don't have much." "Where will you sleep?" "There's a cot in the storeroom," Silas said from the fireplace. He said it matter-of-factly, which was the only way he said anything. "I've been meaning to make it into a proper room since last winter. Never got around to it." Priscilla looked between the two of them. She was 17 and she was not stupid, and she read situations the way young people read situations when they've grown up in a house where reading the room was a survival skill. She said nothing. "I don't want to put anyone out," she said finally. "You're not putting anyone out," Josephine said. "You rode all night on a borrowed horse to warn us. You can sleep in a real room." Priscilla looked at the table, at the maps and documents and months of careful work laid out across it, and then at the fire coming up in the hearth, and then at her sister, and something in her face did what faces do when a person has been holding tension for a very long time and something finally gives. She sat down at the table and put her face in her hands and cried. Not dramatically, just thoroughly, the way people cry when the crisis is over and the body needs to finish what the mind has been suppressing. Josephine set down the coffee pot and went and sat beside her and put her arm around her stepsister's shoulders and held on. She didn't say anything. There was nothing particularly useful to say, and Priscilla didn't need words right now. She needed the arm around her shoulders. Silas looked at the fire and said nothing, which was the right thing, and Josephine recognized it as the right thing. After a while, Priscilla straightened and wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, in a voice that was rough at the edges but holding, "I'm sorry." "Don't," Josephine said. "Mother is going to be furious." "Yes," Josephine said. "She is." "I don't care," Priscilla said. And then after a pause, I care, but not enough." She looked at Josephine. "She was always harder on you than on me. I knew it. I didn't—" She stopped. "I should have said something. Years ago, I should have said something." The room was quiet. The fire had caught fully now and was putting out heat, and outside the last light was leaving the sky. "You were a child," Josephine said. "So was I, when it started." She looked at her hands. "There are things you do when you're a child in a bad house, and there are things you can't. The thing you did was get on a horse last night." She met Priscilla's eyes. "That's enough. That's more than enough." Priscilla nodded. Her eyes were still red, but her jaw was set. The 3 of them ate dinner together that night. Plain food, the same kind of plain food that had been there from the beginning, nothing ceremonial about it. And it was, Josephine thought, one of the stranger and more ordinary evenings of her life. Strange because 2 months ago she had not known this man existed, and now here she was at his table with her stepsister, in a house she'd started to think of as a place she knew. Ordinary because the fire was warm and the food was enough and nobody was performing anything for anyone. After Priscilla went to bed, Josephine stayed at the table with the last of the coffee and the documents she still hadn't fully put away, and Silas sat across from her with the quiet that was just his natural atmosphere, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then he said, "I need to talk to you about the silver." She set down her cup. "All right." He turned his own cup in his hands. He did that when he was working something out. Turned things in his hands as if the thinking lived in the motion. The survey estimate, from what Eleanor knew of it, is substantial, not a small find. He paused. "Once the competing claim is voided, I'll need to make some decisions about how to handle it. It's your land, she said. Your decision. I know that, he said. I'm telling you because… He stopped, started again, which was rare for him. He usually said things right the first time or didn't say them at all. I spent 12 years on this mountain keeping people away, being the man they were afraid of. It worked, mostly, except it also meant I was doing everything alone that two people should probably have been doing. He looked at her directly. And then a girl arrived with no coat and 60 cents in her boot, and in 3 weeks she'd mapped every illegal boundary amendment in the valley and written a letter to a federal marshal without telling me. Josephine looked at the table. I should have told you about the letter. No, he said. You were right not to. I would have said it was a long shot. It was a long shot. It came in, he said. She looked up. His face was doing the thing it did sometimes, open in a way it usually wasn't, without the careful management that was his default mode. He was 42 years old, and he'd been alone on this mountain for 12 years, and the openness cost him something. She could see that, but he was doing it anyway. What I'm trying to say, he said slowly, is that I don't want you to go. She was quiet. Not because I need a records keeper, he said. I mean, I do. The correspondence alone would bury me inside of a month without help, but that's not why. He looked at his cup. I don't know how to say this without it sounding like something it might not be. Then say it badly, she said. I'd rather have it badly said than not said. He looked up at her. Something in his face shifted into something unguarded and almost rueful, the look of a man who has been called on his own caution and recognizes it fairly. I'd like you to stay, he said, not as an employee, as… He paused. I don't know what word fits yet, but something with more weight than employment. The fire cracked. Outside the window, the mountain was dark and still, the way it got on clear, cold nights when the wind was calm. Josephine thought about the square. She thought about Delphine counting coins. She thought about the key, cold in her palm, and the lock on the door, and the spare coat that smelled like wood smoke, and a man talking to a hurt horse in a cold barn. She thought about Eleanor Acree saying, "You're a bit like him," and about Priscilla's arm against hers on the bench in Crooked Pine, and about standing in the middle of a crowd of 40 people and finding her voice coming out clear. She thought about all of it, and then she looked at Silas Calder. The scar, the gray temples, the leg that hurt more than he ever said, the hands that had been both violent and gentle and were now holding a coffee cup like it was the most ordinary moment in the world, which it was. And she said, I'm not going anywhere. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, in that way of his that meant more than it looked like. Good, he said. That was all, just that. But it was enough, and they both understood it was enough, and neither of them felt the need to add anything to it. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that don't make for dramatic telling, but matter enormously in the actual fabric of a life. Hess came back twice from Millhaven with questions and forms and the methodical architecture of a legal case being built correctly. The boundary amendments were officially flagged for reversal by the Territory Court in early December, which meant the Colbert family got their 40 acres back on paper before Christmas, and the Prentice widow got her eastern pasture, and the families who'd been pushed off the Hannigan property were contacted through the Territory office about restitution. Harlan Doss did not go quietly. His lawyer argued process and procedure and the validity of the land office records with the tenacity of a man being paid a great deal of money. He was still in Crooked Pine, still walking the main street, still sitting in his bank building, which Josephine found galling in a way she tried not to let consume her. The law was slow. She knew the law was slow. It was slow for reasons that sometimes made sense and sometimes didn't, and the best thing she could do was continue documenting and continue cooperating with Hess and wait. She was not good at waiting. That was a true thing about herself she'd had to acknowledge. Silas was better at it. He'd had 12 years of practice, living alone on a mountain with nothing but work and time and the mountain itself. He didn't tell her to be patient. He was too smart for that. But he showed her, by example, what patience looked like when it had a purpose. It looked like getting up in the morning and doing the next thing. It looked like rebuilding the barn, which he started in November with Walt Colbert's 2 eldest boys coming up on Saturdays to help. the four of them working in the cold with the sound of hammers coming off the mountain all afternoon. It looked like having something solid to do while the other things took the time they needed. Josephine helped rebuild the barn. She was not particularly skilled at it, and she said so on the first day, and Silas handed her a hammer and said the skill came from doing it and not from knowing how before you started, which she suspected was him saying something about more than carpentry, and she let it stand. Priscilla turned out to be useful with animals in a way nobody had previously given her the opportunity to demonstrate. She had a patience with the horses that reminded Josephine, a little, of Silas in the barn with the hurt mare. Silas noticed it too, and by the second week he was showing her things about the horses without making a lesson of it, just working beside her and letting her pick it up. Josephine watched this happening and felt something in the region of her chest that she didn't have clean words for. Something about what it looked like when people were allowed to be what they were instead of what someone else needed them to be. In December, a letter arrived from the Reed family. Missouri Territory, as Silas had thought. The father had heard something through the territory grapevine about what was happening in Crooked Pine. News traveled in that lateral underground way of frontier communities, carried by travelers and supply routes and letters between people who knew people, and he'd written to Silas directly. 4 pages. Josephine read it at the table while Silas stood by the fire, not asking to read it, which was its own form of restraint. She handed it to him without comment. He read it standing up, which was how he read most things. She watched his face while he read it, and his face did something she hadn't seen before. Something that was not grief and not relief, but a complicated territory between the two that 12 years of held-down truth tends to produce when it finally gets acknowledged from the outside. He set the letter down. "He says the youngest one is in school now," Silas said. His voice was level. "Teaching school, I mean. She grew up. She's a teacher." Josephine looked at him. "Like Eleanor." "Like Eleanor," he said. He picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his coat pocket. Then he went outside and she let him go, because some things need to be processed in cold air and open sky, and she understood that about him by now. He came back in 20 minutes, cold from the wind, and sat down at the table, and they went through the day's correspondence from Hess, and he was steady and present and competent, and she didn't ask what he'd been thinking outside, and he didn't tell her, and that was all right. That was, she thought, what it actually looked like between two people who were building something together. Not speeches, not smooth explanations, just the willingness to be in the same room and do the work and let the other person have the parts they needed to keep. Doss's case was formally filed with the territory court in February. It took another 4 months after that. A trial in Mill Haven, with Hess presenting and Eleanor Cree testifying for 2 full days in her precise schoolteacher's voice, and Walt Colbert sitting in the witness chair with his original deed on the table in front of him and not flinching once under cross-examination. Josephine testified too, about the documents, the correspondence, the pattern she'd mapped, the men who'd come to the ranch with the offer to make her disappear. She sat in the witness chair and kept her voice level and answered every question accurately and didn't look at Doss's table once, not because she was afraid to, but because she'd made a decision that his face was not worth that much of her attention. Doss was convicted on 7 counts: fraudulent alteration of official property records, conspiracy to defraud landowners, interference with territory land rights, and 3 additional charges that the lawyer had tried for months to chip away and failed. He was sentenced to 9 years in the territory penitentiary in Mill Haven and removed from Crooked Pine on a Tuesday morning in June with his lawyer and 2 territory marshals and considerably less presence than he'd carried for the last 4 years. Josephine heard about it from Hess's written report. She didn't go into town to watch. She was at the ranch, at the table, working through the silver mining contract terms that she and Silas had been negotiating with a legitimate mining company out of Denver for the past 2 months. A partnership agreement, not a sale, because Silas had been clear from the beginning that he was not selling his land to anyone for any amount, but a revenue-sharing arrangement that would fund what he intended to do with it. She read Hess's letter and set it aside and went back to the contract language. And when Silas came in from the rebuilt barn that afternoon, she told him what it said, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Good," and washed his hands and sat down to look at the contract with her. She looked at him sideways. "That's it? Good?" He looked up. "What would you like me to say?" "I don't know," she said. "Something. It's over." He considered that. "It's not over," he said. "The families still need to go through restitution proceedings. The land office needs a full audit. The Hannigan place, the people who got pushed off, they need help resettling." He looked at her. "I'd say it's more that one part of it is finished and the rest is just the work." She looked at the contract in front of her, the silver revenue projections, the land use boundaries, the community investment clauses she'd insisted on adding and the Denver company's lawyers had tried to remove and she'd held firm on until they stayed. The rest is just the work. She thought that was possibly the most accurate description of what the next 50 years looked like that she'd ever heard, and also that she was not unhappy about it. The Colbert family came to dinner in July, the first warm night of the season, and Eleanor Cree came with them, and the Prentice widow, and Priscilla roasted a chicken that she'd learned to do from a recipe Eleanor had given her, and they ate outside on the rebuilt porch that Silas and the Colbert boys had finished in May. It was loud in a way the ranch had never been loud before. Walt Colbert had opinions about territory politics and wasn't shy about them, and Nora Colbert laughed at things with her whole body, and the Colbert children eventually ended up running in the yard with the horses watching them over the fence with patient animal confusion. Josephine sat at the end of the porch table and watched all of it and did not feel like an outsider, which was new enough that she still noticed it every time. Eleanor sat beside her at some point in the evening and said, without preamble, "You look different than you did in October." "Different how?" Josephine said. Eleanor considered. "Less like you're waiting for something to go wrong." Josephine thought about that honestly. "I'm still waiting," she said. "A little." "That doesn't go away entirely," Eleanor said. "Spent most of my life waiting for the next bad thing. Probably always will." She picked up her glass. "But you learn to do other things at the same time." Josephine looked at the yard, at Priscilla chasing the Colbert children with a piece of rope for a game whose rules she didn't understand from this distance, laughing at something, fully occupied in this moment and not the next one. At Silas at the far end of the table with Walt, both of them leaning over something Walt had drawn on a piece of paper, arguing about fence line in the comfortable way of men who have known each other long enough to argue without it costing anything. "Yes," Josephine said. "That's about right." There was a moment later when the dinner was winding down and people were saying the things people say when they're putting on their coats, and Josephine was stacking dishes, and Silas came and took half the stack from her hands without asking, and they carried them inside together, and he said quietly in the kitchen, "Good night." "Good night," she said. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of moment that announces itself as significant. It was just a man and a woman in a kitchen on a warm July night, with the sound of their friends outside, and the dishes in the basin, and the fire low, and the mountain above them solid and enormous and entirely indifferent to human arrangements. But Josephine held on to it anyway, because she'd learned in the last 9 months that the moments worth holding on to are rarely the ones that announce themselves. They're the ones that are just there, ordinary and warm and real. The key cold in her palm, the coat too big for her shoulders, a man talking to a hurt horse in the dark, a table with people around it, a room with a door she could lock from the inside, a life that was hers. She had been sold for $32 in a dusty square by a woman who saw her as a liability to be transferred. She had stood in that square and felt the whole town look away and understood, in her bones, that she was on her own. She was still on her own, in the way that every person who has ever had to find their own footing is always on their own at the core of it. That didn't change. She didn't think it was supposed to. But on either side of that aloneness, there were people now. A man who had chosen 12 years ago to sit beside a frightened child in the dark until she could sleep. A stepsister who had gotten on a horse in the cold because it was the right thing to do. An old school teacher with a tin box of irreplaceable documents and a directness that didn't make allowances for what you wished were true. Crooked Pine did not tell the story of the monster on the mountain anymore. It told other stories, the way small towns always do. Some accurate, some embellished, some that got better with retelling. But the shape of the true story was there, in the families who had their land back, in the barn that was newer than the one before it, in the records that now existed to make it harder for the next man who tried to do what Doss had done. Stories don't fix things. Josephine knew that. But they told you what a place believed about itself, and what Crooked Pine was beginning to believe was something different from what it had believed in October, and that was worth something. She dried the last dish and set it on the shelf and looked out the kitchen window at the mountain, dark above the tree line, the same as it had always been, older than the town, older than the silver beneath it, older than everything any of them were trying to sort out down here at its feet. She thought about the laundry she'd left on the line, her father's old shirts, stiffening in the cold. She wondered, briefly, what had happened to them, whether Delphine had brought them in or let them freeze. It didn't matter. That was the thing she'd figured out, slowly, over 9 months of work and cold mornings and a table covered in documents and a man who turned things in his hands when he was thinking. Not everything you leave behind needs to be retrieved. Some things you leave because you had to, and then you go forward, and eventually the distance is enough that you stop turning back to look. She had not been worth $32 to the woman who'd raised her. She had turned out to be worth considerably more than that to herself. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went out to the porch to help her people carry the rest of the dishes in.